Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm back to finally share my June wrap-up. I'm gonna guess this video is up a little bit later than usual. I needed some more time to put it together because at the end of June I was invited to attend the ALA convention in San Diego, which was so incredible. Thank you to ALA for inviting me and having me. Obviously that took up quite a bit of my time, energy, and focus. And now I'm playing a little bit of catch up, but that's okay. But I'm back, so let's talk about what I read in June, starting with Fire Exit by Morgan Talty. This came out on June 4th. I was gifted a galley by Tin House and also an ALC from Libro FM, which is read by Daryl Dennis. Morgan Talty is an Indigenous author belonging to the Penobscot Indian Nation. This is his debut full-length novel, and it is truly astounding. It's about Charles, who lives across the river from the Penobscot Reservation in Maine, as he watches his only daughter grow up without him in her life. Because of blood quantum law, he and the mother decided that he would not claim her as his child because then their daughter wouldn't have any legal claim to her indigenous heritage. So Charles has lived this long, sad, lonely life, keeping this secret and keeping his distance. He's also the sole caretaker for his mother, who's living with dementia. He's recovering from alcohol addiction. So all of that emotional stress leads him to decide that he's no longer willing to keep this secret. Content warnings for references to alcohol addiction and abuse, depictions of depression, dementia, and epileptic episodes, explorations of parent-child estrangement, references to off-page child abuse, homophobia and some use of homophobic and ableist slurs, descriptions of sexism, hunting, and graphic animal death, graphic violence, blood, injury, and some gun violence. Morgan Talty wrote one of the best short story collections I've ever read. It's called Night of the Living Rez, and it is so abrasively human and visceral in a way that I can't even do justice in words. His writing has a way of just cutting to the quick, getting to the core of what truly matters for a scene, for a character, in a way that is deceptively simple at first glance, but is in fact so incredibly meticulous. This full-length novel is no different. It's all the best parts of his writing, but just more drawn out, more in-depth, more expansive. As a non-Indigenous person myself, it's not my place to comment on blood quantum laws in the United States and the profound impact they've had on untold numbers of Indigenous communities and peoples in so many different ways, and really this story doesn't set out to interrogate those laws on the page either, but rather attempts to humanize how federal gatekeeping has splintered this one man's life. Rather than opting to be like a 101 kind of story discussing blood quantum law, its origins, its purposes, the story is just about how that inability to claim one's culture and heritage trickles outwards and impacts our ability to see and fully understand ourselves. The parallels between Charles and his daughter in that sense are so incredibly profound because there's a part of themselves, a part of their history that they don't even know is theirs to claim in the first place, and they're both struggling not to be pulled into a void that they don't even really know exists. And I really appreciate how this story doesn't attempt to romanticize the concept of history. When we talk about how these characters in different ways are all entitled to a history they can't truly access, that means both the beautiful parts of that history and also the ugly, deeply uncomfortable parts. The nature of this storytelling is very layered as it oscillates back and forth between past and present, between personal history and shared history, and I really love how it painstakingly illustrates how history, especially when it comes to community and family, is something that we create together. It's a never-ending project of reconciling all the different perspectives we have of our overlapping experiences and learning how to live in that dissonance. This book just left me speechless. The audiobook is so incredibly well performed as well. Without a single shred of doubt in my mind, I can absolutely say this book is 5 stars. After that, I listened to Isabel and the Rogue by Liana de la Rosa. I was kindly gifted a finished copy by Berkeley Romance, and I was also granted access to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, and the audiobook itself is read by Ruby Hunt. This is the sequel/companion to Ana Maria and the Fox. It is a Latina historical romance series about these 3 sisters whose parents are very deeply involved in the Mexican government during France's occupation of Mexico. So for their own safety, they're sent to live with their uncle in London, where they're meant to blend into high society so that they might garner some political sympathy for Mexico amongst the upper classes. The second book follows the middle sister, Isabel, who's bookish and incredibly introverted. She's often overlooked and ignored in polite society, but she's decided to make use of her invisibility by secretly slipping away during parties and sending any intel she discovers back to the Mexican government. Enter Captain Sirius Dawson, the dashing and rakish covert agent for the British Home Office, who also spends his days gathering intelligence by any means necessary, even if it means sleeping with his marks. And when he and Isabel catch each other in a compromising position, it quickly becomes clear that they might not be able to resist one another, no matter how unfailingly loyal they might be to their respective countries. Content warnings for explorations of PTSD and survivor's guilt, some discussions of colonization and forced displacement, experienced racism and colorism, and some explicit sexual content. This was a really fun time. I found Ana Maria and the Fox to be so incredibly delightful and refreshing, especially in the historical romance space, and even though I didn't love this second book quite as much, I did still enjoy it. I do have to say this second book is way more sensual and steamy than the first, so if a plethora of sexual exploration is something you enjoy in your historical romance, then this book will not disappoint. Let it be known, I have no aversion to spicy scenes, but I think especially as a demisexual person, it's always hard for me to fully get on board with a couple when the ratio of physical intimacy outpaces moments of non-physical intimacy and connection, so that's just my 2 cents. But I still enjoyed how tropey this romance was. I love that Isabel is almost playing against her type in some ways because she's expected to be this demure, delicate, withering wallflower, but secretly she's incredibly bold and brazen, and she's not afraid to get her hands dirty and take some really big risks. This concept of two spies, but people who are spies in very different capacities and for very different reasons, is such a fun idea for a romance. It creates a lot of opportunities for tension and conflict, especially when both characters are so unfailingly loyal to their respective cause. All that said, as I already mentioned, I didn't quite connect with this couple as much as the couple in the first book, not for lack of chemistry, but just because I felt a little bit underwhelmed by the lack of emotional development. And I think that ties into a larger issue I have with the book structurally, because I don't feel like it quite delivers on the political commentary, especially that it's trying to tap into and that it puts forth in the premise. While Captain Dawson himself is somewhat anachronistically of a decolonial mindset, which is great, the story never really contends with how he has served and is in some ways still serving a colonial imperialist government. And while the British may not be the country currently colonizing Mexico, there's an ideological tension there between his actions and Isabel's actions that's never really addressed. And I get why it's not addressed, because he's one of the good guys, right? And while I respect that and while I love that for Isabel, the story doesn't feel fully satisfying because the characters aren't given a chance to navigate the difference in their perspectives and experiences. Again, I had a good time, I just wanted a bit more from the story and from the romantic arc, and I cannot wait for book 3. I think it's gonna be the one, but I would still give this 3.5 stars. Then I did a complete 180 and I listened to The Other Olympians, Fascism, Queerness, and the Making of Modern Sports by Michael Waters. I was sent an ARC from FSG Books, and I also listened to the audiobook, which is read by Jennifer Pickens. This is a queer history book. It excavates the history of early trans and intersex athletes, especially ones who competed on an international stage, and also the Olympic bureaucrats who decided to interpret their gender or their bodies as a threat and as an excuse to develop early models of gender surveillance. It's not only telling the incredible stories of these trans and intersex athletes, but also exploring how their lives and their visibility were sort of on a collision course with Nazi Germany in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, and how those fascist views and policies also played a role in igniting these culture wars that we still see continuing to this day. Content warnings for experienced transphobia, explorations of sexism, white supremacy, racism, colonialism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitic violence, references to the Holocaust, discussions of sex essentialism and gender essentialism, descriptions of gender dysphoria and gender-based discrimination, and brief references to suicide. This is not the kind of nonfiction I usually read. I think I tend to read more memoirs or narrative nonfiction. I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not a historically minded person either, by which I mean my brain doesn't usually tend to do well processing dates and international policies and historical figures, but even though I was a little bit intimidated by this book's project, its subtitle, its deep dive into the intersections of fascism and gender politics, something in me told me that I had to request it and I had to read it. That little voice, that little bit of intuition was so incredibly spot on, because this is essential reading. This book is nothing less than a gift. On the one hand, yes, this book absolutely does everything it sets out to do in outlining and deconstructing how the perception of a threat, as opposed to an actual present threat proposed by the disruptive existence of trans and intersex bodies, has contributed to a damaging and enduring legacy of gender surveillance. But it's also, at least in part, about excavating and celebrating these incredible trans and intersex stories that have otherwise been almost completely lost to time and erased. And even though I personally don't relate to the experience of binary transness, it was such a restorative and healing experience to learn about these athletes' lives, to learn about the surprising ways in which they were actually affirmed and embraced by the masses. When we think about gender affirming care, when we think about physical, medical, or social transition, it can feel like those things have only recently come even somewhat within reach, but it's history like this that reminds us that trans people have always existed and have always found ways to affirm and live in their transness. That is a beautiful thing. You cannot put a price on that kind of history, on this kind of invaluable work that forces global history and trans history to stand side by side, and not because they contradict each other, but because they reveal essential information about each other. That is priceless. But I deeply respect the work this book is doing. I appreciate how it points out the egregious contradictions when it comes to how gender policing policies claim to protect the integrity of women's sports especially, while actively harming women and feminine presenting athletes by subjecting their bodies to wholly arbitrary and unidentifiable boundaries of womanhood. There's also the pervasiveness and insidiousness of white supremacy and Eurocentric beauty standards to contend with, which ties back in with Nazi Germany and the rise of fascism, seeing as how the majority of athletes who are negatively impacted by and gatekept from sport because of gender surveillance are those of marginalized genders and races. It's a really complex tangle of the personal histories of these trans and intersex athletes with global politics and patriarchal systems of misogynistic violence just being on this collision course with each other. And I so appreciate how the author painstakingly extracts each of those threads and helps the reader to examine and comprehend this complex and entirely contrived relationship between gender and policy. It's so informative, it's so eye-opening the way the author parallels what seems like distant and forgotten history with issues and anti-transness that we're still very much contending with to this day. It is absolutely brilliantly done. The project of this book is such an ambitious undertaking, to say the very least, and there's definitely things that could have been expounded upon even more, but I could not look away once I picked this up. I highly, highly recommend this. I gave it a huge 5 stars. If you saw my most recent reading vlog, you know I also marathon through The Fireborn Blade and The Bloodless Princes by Charlotte Bond, the first 2 books in the Fireborn Blade novella series. Those were kindly sent to me by Tor.com Publishing, and if you want to know what I thought of them, you can check out that video, which I will have linked down below. After that, I finished my arc of Asunder by Kirsten Hall, which comes out on August 20th from Tor.com. This is marketed as a new standalone fantasy novel. I would say it's a mixture of dark fantasy and horror. The story follows Karis Eska, who signed away her life and her soul to an eldritch monster in exchange for the ability to death speak, which means she can communicate with those who are recently deceased. In exchange for this power, she uses her death magic to investigate suspicious deaths around the city, and one of those investigations leads her to uncovering a horrific new species, as well as a deeply tangled political conspiracy, and she ends up accidentally binding herself to a dying stranger who might just be her only chance to uncover the truth. Content warnings for death, gore, body horror, and explorations of grief, references to animal death, brief mentions of rape and suicide, experienced physical abuse, and references to past off-page child abuse. This book had me, and quite frankly still has me, in an absolute chokehold. Every time I cracked open this book, I was fully immersed in the fantasy world, in the fantasy horror aesthetics, fully invested in the characters and everything they were bringing to the table, and honestly, it was one of the most dynamic reading experiences I think I've had so far this year. What I really appreciate is how this fantasy story is able to blend together so many seemingly opposing elements. There's an undeniable darkness and gravity to the story that you cannot look away from, but there's also pieces of this fantasy world that are so imaginative and almost whimsical at times. Like, even though the overall tone of the story is dark, harrowing, emotional. There's also so many delightful things to discover in this fantasy world and about this cast of characters, and it also feels very adventurous. And I love how there's an undercurrent of romance holding the story together, even though I would categorically not consider this to be a romance. Like I said, it is unquestionably a fantasy horror story. That is the predominant through line of the book, but it also makes such good use of these classic romantic tropes to further heighten the emotional stakes. With Karis and Firaine physically occupying the same body, there's forced proximity. There's a grumpy sunshine sort of dynamic since Karis is very hardened by life and used to being alone, while Firaine is much more effusive and outgoing and curious. And most of all, there's this slow burn pining, this desperate, torturous yearning that is so delicious. The chemistry and connection between these two characters is so palpable, it's so easy, so organic, and for very obvious reasons, that is a gap they cannot breach no matter what they do. And the torture of not being able to resolve that tension had me so fucking weak. Don't even get me started on the narrative and emotional parallels between the eldritch monster Karis is sharing her body with and this absolute treasure trove of a cinnamon roll who lives inside her shadow. The two of those characters bonded to Karis, and the way they interact with her could not be more different. I love a story where a loner character who's been forced to be strong their entire life and depend on no one else besides themselves is gradually having their walls broken down and their world open up, and that's exactly what's happening in this story. It's one of those fantasy stories where the main character is slowly collecting unexpected companions as they continue their journey, and it's especially endearing with Karis, who, like I said, is very emotionally reserved and purposefully tries to keep herself at a distance. But as the story goes on, she finds herself more and more powerless to resist those connections. So much of this book was just written for me specifically. The fantasy horror sensibilities are my catnip. The unbroachable, endless yearning tortured me until the very end, and I would happily endure it again. And ultimately, I think it's a gripping and provocative exploration of learning how to hope, even when we're conditioned to believe that everything is and always will be hopeless. I will say the ending is a gut punch, to say the very least, and it hurt me in new and frankly unforgettable ways. I do also think the world building could have been a bit stronger. We learn about all these different places and cultures in this fantasy world, but even by the end, the dynamics and politics between them are still a bit hazy. But this book fucked me up good, and I would happily let Kirsten Hall fuck me up again. I gave it a very strong 4.5 stars. I also finally got a chance to read Rough Trade by Caterina Carrasco. I was sent an e-arc from MCT Books, but I also listened to the audiobook read by Stacey Gonzalez. This is the sequel to one of my favorite books ever, The Best Bad Things. It's queer, it's gender fucky, it's bisexual as hell, and I love it so much. The story is about a former undercover agent known as Alma Rosales, who is Mexican American and also known for her extremely taboo tendency of going undercover as a man, which is part of the reason why she was ousted from her former agency. Now it's 1888 and she finds herself in the Pacific Northwest, where she's living full-time as Jack Camp and running a highly lucrative, highly dangerous opium smuggling operation out of the Washington port. But when two local men end up dead, all signs begin pointing to the opium trade, which is bad for business and also brings lawmen into town, as well as Bess Spencer, a fellow ex-agent and Alma's first love. Content warnings for some explorations of drug abuse, addiction, and overdose, death, and grief, references to child abandonment, graphic injury and violence, experienced homophobia and ableism, and some sexual content. Also, before I get into it, I do want to mention that Alma is not only bisexual, but also presenting and living as a man 100% of the time. The story doesn't comment on how she identifies specifically, but when the story is told from her third-person perspective, it does use she/her pronouns, and so I will reflect that choice. But also, now seems like a good time for a friendly reminder that anyone of any gender can use any pronouns they want, even if those pronouns don't quote-unquote match. I love The Best Bad Thing so freaking much. It is criminally underrated, no pun intended, and I will happily die on the hill of its greatness. So many more people need to read it. It should be one of the most talked about books. Much like The Best Bad Things, this sequel/companion is thrilling, suspenseful, action-packed, unbelievably gender-fucky, and so much fun to read. Catrina Carrasco is so good at finding a compelling B plot to really compel the story forward while also heightening the stakes. In the first book, she breaks up the chapters with this police transcript of an ongoing interrogation, and that draws the reader in that much more because, in a way, they know the end result, but they don't know how the chips fell the way they did. And even with all the cards seemingly on the table, there's still room for surprises. In this book, rather than playing with structure in that way, she introduces this secondary character working to uncover how far this illegal drug smuggling ring goes. He exists as kind of a foil for Alma, but interestingly enough, as he's going undercover to try and bust this operation open from the inside, he's also discovering his own queerness. I really love that storyline because it not only echoes Alma's own experiences of stepping into her power and her identity as Jack, who was supposed to be just a cover for one of her jobs, but it also complicates everyone's positions because now emotions are dirtying some already seriously nasty business. Unrelated, but I have to give major props to the audiobook narrator, Stacey Gonzalez. They did such a great job of actually masking their voice as masculine when performing Alma's dialogue, which I had hoped for, but I didn't actually expect. I was almost nervous to start the audiobook because I didn't want the spell of Alma's gender presentation, which is so incredibly confident, strong, and consistent, to be broken by someone just trying to make a feminine voice seem more gruff. But they did a great job of audibly showing exactly how much and how easily Alma passes as Jack. And thematically, again, much like the first book, the story does such a great job of exploring all the ways we seek out and exchange power in our day-to-day lives. Power can be gained, it can be given, it can be taken, it can be discovered, it can be exercised over other people, and the story intimately understands all of those dynamics and nuances. I appreciate the larger themes at play in what seems like a straightforward historical crime thriller on the surface. It's about the hard-hitting reality of how we might have our own plans and our own ideas of how things are going to work out, but the truth is that as complex as they might be, sometimes the entirety of our life ends up just being one cog in someone else's machine. But even though that sounds daunting and hopeless, for a lot of these characters, it just serves to light a fire under them even more and motivates them to counteract those greater machinations through the transgressive and disruptive choices they make. And in a way, the story is also touching on how otherness is not only criminalized through legal and official avenues, but how that systemic criminalization becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because when people of stigmatized identities and backgrounds don't have a place in society, they are often forced to turn to crime or illegal activities as a means to survive. And at the same time, counterculture itself, whether that's unsanctioned community spaces, underground social justice movements, transgressive forms of community care, protest, or even just marginalized people daring to exist in public, has always been considered criminal, whether it's actually criminal or not. So there's a lot to chew on in this book, and it's also entertaining as hell. I also love that Alma's gender, whatever it might be, is built into the story as a non-issue. She is Alma, and she is also Jack. Both of those things are true at the same time, and we as the reader do not have to pick apart the greater implications of her existence. She is given the freedom and space on page to just be who she is. I will say, this book was so close to being 5 stars, but it does sort of lose steam towards the very end. It's building up to what seems like an explosive breaking point that kind of ends up being swept under the rug so everything can wrap up quickly and neatly. If it was maybe 30 to 50 pages longer, it would have been perfect. But I still highly recommend both books. I hope this is not the last we see of Jack Camp, and I gave this 4.5 stars. Then in the first week of Tome Topple, I flew through A Taste of Golden Iron by Alexandra Rowland. I also listened to this as an audiobook from my library, which is read by Casey Jones. This is a queer romantasy set in a fantasy world very loosely inspired by the countries contained within the Ottoman Empire. It's about Prince Cadeau, who's incredibly shy and anxious, and in an incredibly unfortunate domino effect of events, he's wrongfully accused of attempting to stage a coup. As one does. Because of that, he's been banned from court, he's been publicly dishonored, and his sister, the queen, decides to completely overhaul his personal guard and replaces them with Evamir, one of the guard's most promising cadets, who's incredibly stoic, self-disciplined, and strict. Attempting to win back his sister's trust, Kado and Evamir begin investigating a recent break-in at one of the kingdom's guilds, and not only do they accidentally uncover a sinister conspiracy, but they also begin to fall in love in the process. Content warnings for experienced anxiety and panic attacks, some animal death, blood, injury, and some graphic violence, experienced ableism, both internal and external, and some sexual content. I don't know what I expected going into this one, but I loved it so much. I blew through it in like 3 days or something like that, which is wild. For some reason, I always thought it would take me a while to get into, maybe because it's a 500-page high fantasy book, but I became so invested so incredibly fast. Like I said in my Tome Topple TBR, I love a bodyguard romance, and this one is delectable. The absolute journey both of these characters went on had me so deep and so lost in my emotions. Evamir especially goes from being Kado's #1 hater to being his #1 fan in an absolutely bumbling and endearing series of adorable events. If you love reading romances where one or more of the romantic heroes are just absolutely down for the count, just completely and unabashedly enamored with the objects of their affection to the point of complete distraction, abandon, and devotion, this is the book for you. And while this story is definitely emotional and serious at times, especially in the ways it explores Kado's mental health, his experiences with severe anxiety and panic attacks, it's also super silly and goofy and unserious in a way that I didn't fully expect. Honestly, I kind of blame the US cover, which is absolutely stunning, incredibly well designed, and perfectly gets across the story's sense of intimacy and sensuality, but it also doesn't quite capture how this book is every bit as funny as it is romantic. The author describes this book as fealty plus feelings, and I honestly think that's the perfect description. I appreciate how the story breaks down issues of agency and consent, especially in a relationship where one party holds so much power over the other, and I love how the story's thesis is that fealty and loyalty have to be a two-way street. If they're not reciprocated, then there's an imbalance. So I see and respect how the story is mindful about those gaps, and I love how torturously slow burn the story is as a result, as the characters really take their time in sorting out their feelings and trying to understand how their relationship might work. But even though it is slow burn, there's also room for tropey shenanigans along the way where the characters are so close to being together but not actually able to be together for plot reasons, which is, again, my catnip. Honestly, I just love everything this story was doing. It took the characters on epic journeys of self-growth, but in such a quiet and thoughtful way as the relationship between them gradually deepens. There's political intrigue, there's conspiracy, there's mystery, there's tomfoolery, there's found family, what's not to like? I do think that Kado's mental health kind of gets pushed to the side as the story progresses, maybe unintentionally, which kind of implies that this epic romantic love was all he really needed to be more confident and not have to deal with anxiety as much. And while the story does attempt to explicitly say that his anxiety hasn't gone away, the actual narrative of the story fails to show that at times. I also thought the world building could have been a little bit stronger, and I think the story could have also ended maybe 50 pages sooner than it did. It tries to introduce one last hurdle between Kado and Evermir's happily ever after, but it just ends up petering out and turning into nothing, so that shows me that we could have had a slightly tighter pace. But like I said, I had so much fun reading this. It's cute and tropey, the characters and romance were so incredibly endearing and delightful. I will definitely read more from Alexandra Rowland, and I gave their debut 4.5 stars. Last but certainly not least, I read my Patreon pick for the month, and in a somewhat surprising upset, my patrons voted for me to read Ocean's Godori by Elaine Yu Cho, and the audiobook is read by Judy Alice Lee. This is a Korean-inspired space opera. It's about a Korean character named Ocean who happens to be the most hated person at the Alliance, which is Korea's solar system dominating space agency ever since a mission went horribly wrong and she earned a reputation for mishandling her weapons. When her best friend Teo is framed for a horrific crime, Ocean and her misfit crew are pushed to the forefront of a high-stakes ideological conflict where dodging bullets and winning space chases might just be the least of their problems. Content warnings for references to sibling death, parent death, and grief, as well as some graphic injury and graphic violence. I don't think I have too much to say about this. It didn't blow me away, but I did enjoy it. I love sci-fi space operas about a ragtag crew going up against the odds and attempting to do the impossible. This is definitely a fast-paced, adventurous, high-stakes space opera, so I would say it does deliver in that sense. I also just found this to be an interesting blend of writing styles. Like I said, it's very action-forward, it's punchy, the characters can be tongue-in-cheek, everything you would expect from a space crew of underdogs, but then it also has these more reflective moments and quiet moments where it becomes introspective, and the sci-fi elements almost drop away completely as the characters look within themselves to make these very human connections with what they're experiencing. I don't quite know how to put those moments into words, but I would say it's almost like nostalgic. Somewhat related to that, I love that the first part of the story is grounded in this futuristic version of Korea. I think the story has really interesting ideas about new kinds of technologies and social norms that have emerged in Korea in this fictional distant future, and even though it is distant, there's still a very clear connection to the past. This space opera is also just like a love letter to nerds and nerdy fandom. There's all these pop culture Easter eggs baked into different parts of the story. There's also these fictional Korean dramas that the characters love watching together as a crew, and those were also a bit referential, so I thought all of that was really fun. Other than that though, I didn't really get much else from this story. It kind of stayed on a surface level for the most part and never really progressed further than that. The character connections and political motivations are also hazy at best. We're told in the synopsis that Teo is Ocean's best friend, but we don't actually get to feel any sort of deep connection in the story. The two of them don't even really think about each other or contact each other in their respective POV sections. It isn't until they're physically in the same place almost over halfway through the story that we actually get to see them have any kind of remotely meaningful connection. And while the action and sci-fi elements were really entertaining, it felt like the story was missing the puzzle piece of why all these things are happening in the first place. Especially with Teo being framed for this heinous crime, there's a mystery element, there's a question mark there that the story doesn't really bother diving into until a villain finally gives their "and here's why I did it" speech at the end. Sadly, the pacing is also off because it really spikes at the end and sets up this explosive ending that never truly comes to fruition. The story just sort of ends unceremoniously, so there were just too many structural problems with the story for me to wholeheartedly enjoy the reading process. But even with all that said, it was still a really fun project, and I would love to see what this author does next. In the end, I gave this 3 stars. Before I wrap up the wrap-up, I was, of course, participating in the Queer Lit Readathon all month long, so let's do a quick overview of how my bingo board played out by the end of June. Okay, so Asunder absolutely counted towards creepy queers. Karis is hugely bisexual. I don't know if I said that earlier, but she is. Rough Trade counted for continued, since it is the sequel to The Best Bad Things, and I counted both Fireborn Blade novellas towards the magic space. A Taste of Golden Iron aggressively counts for the mental health space. Teo is queer in Ocean's Godori, so I put that towards the international space, and I put the other Olympians in the free space, which I decided to make nonfiction, although it could also count towards the international space. So I did end up getting a bingo in the far right column, and yes, I am proud of myself. But that is everything I read in June. If you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, please feel free to drop your thoughts down below in the comments, or you can share your favorite thing that you read, listened to, watched, or did in June. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.